She had been in that house for 11 days before anyone realized who she was. Not the housekeeper, not the cook, not the young footman who brought coal to the upstairs rooms each morning and never once looked at her face. She had worn gray every day, kept her hair pinned flat, and answered to the name Marsh, which was her mother's maiden name, and which she had not used since she was 7 years old, and still believed that names were the most important things a person could possess. She had been wrong about that. She knew better now. The house was called Ashveil, and it had belonged to the Pendreth family for 4 generations. Her family. Her grandmother had planted the roses along the east wall. Her father had carved his initials into the stone above the kitchen door when he was 9 years old, and the letters were still there, PHP, though no one in the current household seemed to know what they stood for. She had touched them on her second morning, when the cook sent her out to bring in wood, and she had pressed her fingers into the grooves and stood there longer than she should have. The Duke of Ashveil had acquired the estate 3 years ago in a manner that was perfectly legal and entirely without conscience. Her name, her real name, was Philippa Pendreth. She was 28 years old. She had been dispossessed of her inheritance through a clause in her father's will that no one had thought to explain to her until it was already too late. A clause that named her uncle as executor with full discretionary authority. And her uncle had exercised that authority with considerable enthusiasm. The estate had gone to settle debts she had not known existed. The London townhouse had followed. Then the small property in Derbyshire. Then, finally, the last of her mother's jewelry, which her uncle had sold without telling her, and which she had discovered missing one morning, when she opened the case to take out a pearl brooch for church. By the time she understood what had happened, the Duke had already taken possession of Ashveil. She had not come back to reclaim it. She was not so foolish as to imagine that was possible. She had come back because her father's solicitor, old Mr. Hartley, who had retired but still kept his files, had written to her in the lodging house in Edinburgh where she had spent the past 2 winters, and had told her that there was a document, a letter actually written in her father's hand and sealed, which had been overlooked in the settlement proceedings. He could not say what it contained. He could not produce it himself because it had been filed with the estate papers and was therefore now in the Duke's possession, in the library at Ashveil, likely in the second cabinet from the left along the north wall, because that was where her father had always kept his private correspondence, and some things, apparently, did not change even when everything else did. She had read Mr. Hartley's letter 4 times. Then she had packed a single bag, taken the train south, and presented herself at the servants' entrance of her own family home looking for work. They had needed a housemaid. She had references which she had written herself and which were technically fraudulent, though she preferred not to think about that. The housekeeper, a capable, unsmiling woman named Mrs. Alderton, had looked her over, asked 3 questions, and told her she could start Monday. She had started Monday. The library was locked. This was the first difficulty she had not anticipated, which said something about the condition of her thinking at the time. She had imagined walking in on a quiet afternoon, finding the cabinet, taking the letter, and leaving before anyone noticed she had been there. She had not imagined a locked library. She had not imagined that the Duke kept the key on his person, apparently at all times, because she had asked the other housemaid, a cheerful girl named Daisy who had worked at Ashveil for 2 years and knew everything, whether the library was ever left open, and Daisy had laughed and said not since the new Duke came. No, he was particular about that room, very particular indeed. So she waited. She did her work. She carried trays and turned down beds and learned which floorboards creaked and which doors stuck in damp weather. She learned that the Duke took his breakfast alone at 7, that he rode out most mornings, for an hour, that he had a habit of standing at the library window in the late afternoon and looking out at the east garden with an expression she could not read from a distance but which did not look like contentment. She learned that he was to hold a dinner, not a small dinner. A dinner for 40 guests over 2 evenings, the kind of event that required every member of the household staff to be occupied from early morning until long past midnight. The kind of event that left doors unlocked, that created reasons for people to be in rooms they would not ordinarily enter, that produced enough movement and noise and general confusion to make almost anything possible. She heard about it on a Thursday. The dinner was on Saturday. She spent Friday night lying awake, going over the plan she had made, which was thin in several places, and depended on the library key being set down at some point during the evening's activity, which was not guaranteed. She did not sleep well. She had not slept well in 3 years. Saturday came gray and cold, the way October mornings sometimes did in that part of the country, with a low sky that pressed down on the fields and made the house feel smaller than it was. She dressed and went down to the kitchen and began her day. By noon the house was alive with preparation. Flowers had arrived from the village. The dining room had been opened and laid, and the silver that had been her grandmother's. She recognized each piece with a precision that was almost painful, was arranged along the table in the candlelight. She carried things. She was directed from room to room. She kept her face smooth and her eyes down, which was not difficult because she had learned in the past 3 years that a woman who made herself small was rarely looked at closely. The guests began arriving at 7. She was stationed in the upstairs hall, ready to direct people to their rooms if they required them, to take wraps, to be generally useful and entirely invisible. She was good at this. She had become very good at this. It was from the upstairs hall that she first saw the woman who arrived with the Duke. She had known he was not married. Daisy had mentioned it. The Duke was not married, had never been married, though there had been talk last year of a girl from a good family in Edinburgh. Nothing had come of it. He lived at Ashveil alone, which the older members of the staff found unusual for a man of his position, though Daisy found it romantic in a way she could not quite articulate. The woman who came in on the Duke's arm was not a wife. This was clear from the way she moved, from the way she looked at the assembled guests, assessing them, placing them, calculating, and from the way the Duke looked at her, which was attentive but not tender. She was beautiful in an arranged sort of way, fair-haired and composed, wearing something that cost a great deal of money. Her name, Philippa learned from the fragments of conversation that drifted up the stairs, was Miss Alderton. Not the housekeeper, a different Alderton entirely, no relation, Miss Josephine Alderton, whose father had interests in several of the same industries as the Duke. She did not think much about it at first. It was not her business. She was watching the library door. The Duke had been carrying the key. She had noticed it on his watch chain that morning, a small iron key that sat beside the gold one, and which she had looked at for as long as she dared. During the first hour of the dinner he remained in the dining room. During the second hour she could hear him from the hall, his voice lower than the others, measured. He had a voice she had noticed from her first day in the house. Not warm exactly, but certain. Like a man who had made most of his decisions already and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. At 9:30, the guests moved to the drawing room. At 9:45, Philippa watched the Duke excuse himself from a conversation with a man in a military coat and cross the hall toward the library. She did not move. She stood precisely where she was, holding a wrap she had been asked to find a place for, and she watched him unlock the door and go inside. She watched the door close. She watched the strip of light appear beneath it. She gave him 12 minutes. Then she crossed the hall, knocked once very quietly, and opened the door. He was standing at the north wall. At the cabinet, the second from the left, with a folder of papers open in his hand. He turned when she came in, and she saw his face cycle through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, irritation, and then something else, something more careful. She did not give him time to speak. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said. "I was told to bring extra candles." She was not carrying candles. They both knew this. He looked at her for a long moment. He had blue eyes. She had not been close enough before to notice, and they were doing something she could not quite account for, something between recognition and uncertainty. "You were not told to bring candles," he said. "No," she agreed. The silence that followed was the longest of her life, or at least it felt that way. "Marsh," he said, "that is what Mrs. Alderton calls you. It is the name I gave, and before that?" She did not answer. He looked down at the folder in his hand, and then he looked back at her, and she saw the moment something shifted. A small movement, like a card being turned over. "I found this 3 weeks ago," he said, "when I was going through the estate records." He held up the folder. "I did not know what to do with it. I have been thinking about it since." She looked at the folder. Her father's seal was on the outside, the red wax broken. Her name was written underneath it, her full name, in her father's handwriting, which she had not seen in 3 years, which still undid her in ways she could not prepare for. She did not cry. She had decided, a long time ago, that she would not do that in front of anyone she did not trust completely. And she did not know yet whether to trust this man, though the question was beginning to feel different from how it had felt an hour ago. "What does it say?" she asked. "That your father did not intend the estate to pass to your uncle," the Duke said. That the discretionary clause was written for a different purpose and was applied in a manner he specifically wished to prevent. That Ashveil was meant to be held in trust for you until you married or reached the age of 30, whichever came first. He paused. "You are not yet 30. "No," she said, "not yet. The solicitors who handled the settlement missed it," he said. "Or did not miss it." He said this without inflection, which she found more damning than any tone would have been. The letter was buried in a folder of household accounts. I do not think it was found accidentally. She absorbed this. She had suspected something of the kind for 2 years, but had not had the peace that made it coherent. Now she did, and it sat in her chest like something very cold and very still. "Why did you not contact me?" she asked. "I did not know how to find you." He set the folder down on the desk, carefully, as though it were something that mattered. "And I was not certain, when I found it, what the correct course of action was. The transfer is legal. It was conducted through proper channels. The letter does not undo what was done, but it does change the character of what was done considerably." She looked at him. He was watching her with that same careful expression, the one she had seen from the hall that first day through the window. Not contentment, she understood now. Something more like a man who had been sitting with a question he did not know how to answer. "You could have simply not told anyone," she said. "Yes," he said, "I could have. The house would have remained yours." "Yes." "You would have lost nothing." "Nothing material," he agreed. She did not know what to do with this. She had spent 3 years building a very specific picture of what kind of man could live in her family's house without discomfort. And this conversation was dismantling it piece by piece, which was inconvenient because she had found the picture useful and had not brought anything to replace it. "I came for the letter," she said. "Only for the letter. I did not have any larger plan." "I know," he said. "You have been here 11 days, and you have not done anything except work very efficiently, and look at the books in the hallway when you thought no one was watching." She felt warmth move up her face, which annoyed her. "I was not aware I was observed." "You are not easy to observe directly," he said. "You are very good at being in the edge of a room. But I grew up with 4 sisters, and I learned early to watch the edges." The dinner was continuing in the other part of the house. She could hear it distantly. Voices, the movement of chairs, someone laughing at something. A whole other world proceeding without them. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends," he said, "on what you want." He said it simply, without the quality of a man offering something he expected to be declined. He said it the way a person said it when they genuinely did not know the answer and were asking in earnest. She thought about what she wanted. This was not something she had allowed herself to do in any extended way for 3 years, because wanting things that were not available was a kind of suffering she had decided to decline. But she thought about it now, standing in the library of her father's house, looking at the man who had bought it, who had found the letter, who had not destroyed it. "I want to read it," she said, "the letter." He picked up the folder and held it out to her. She took it. She did not read it in front of him. She crossed to the chair by the window, her father's chair, the one that still had the worn patch on the left arm from 30 years of his elbow resting there, and she sat down and she opened the folder, and she read. Her father's voice came back to her in the way it always did when she read his handwriting. Measured and a little formal, the way he wrote letters as opposed to the way he spoke, which had been warmer, quicker, full of the particular humor of a man who found most things faintly amusing. He had written the letter 2 months before he died. He had known he was ill and had not told her, which she had spent some time being angry about, and had arrived, eventually, at understanding. He had written that Ashveil was hers. He had written that he was sorry he had not found a way to make this cleaner, less susceptible to the kind of people who looked for cracks in things. He had written that he hoped she would be practical, more practical than he had been, and that he hoped she would not be lonely, and that the roses along the east wall needed cutting back in autumn, or they would become unmanageable, which was such an entirely characteristic thing for him to have included that she pressed her hand flat against the page and sat very still for a moment. She looked up. The Duke had moved to the window and was looking out at the dark garden, giving her what she understood was meant to be privacy, though they were still in the same room. "He knew," she said. "He knew what my uncle was likely to do." "It seems so," the Duke said, without turning around. "The letter reads as though he was attempting to prevent it and suspected he might not succeed. He didn't succeed." "No." She folded the letter. She held it in her hands and looked at it, at her name in her father's writing, and she thought about the past 3 years with the particular clarity of someone who had just been handed a key to something she had not known was locked. "What did you mean to do?" she said. "Before I appeared tonight." He turned from the window then. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely interpret. There was something in it she had not expected to find, something a little rueful, a little like a man who had been waiting to be asked a question and was not sure, now that it had been asked, how to answer it honestly. "I had written to my solicitor," he said. "I was intending to explore whether there was any legal mechanism by which—" He paused, whether the letter constituted sufficient grounds to revisit the settlement. And I was told it likely did not formally, but that it might create sufficient discomfort for the parties involved to make other arrangements preferable. She looked at him. "You were going to pressure my uncle," she said. "I was going to explore my options," he said, which was a careful way of saying yes. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone in the drawing room laughed again. A clear, uncomplicated sound that seemed to come from a different kind of evening entirely. "Because I read the letter," he said. "And I read what your father wrote, and I thought about the fact that someone had put it in a folder of household accounts and hoped no one would notice, and I found that I did not want to be the person who also did not notice." He said this steadily, without drama, the way a person stated a conclusion they had arrived at privately and were now simply reporting. "It is not complicated, really. I have enough. I have more than enough. The question of whether I also have this house. He looked around the library, at the shelves, at the cabinet, at the chair where she was sitting, seems, in context, like a smaller question than it did before I read that letter. Philippa was quiet for a long time. She had not expected this. She had expected the house to be impenetrable, the library to be inaccessible, the letter to be lost. She had expected to fail, and then to decide what to do next after failing. She had built her expectations very low and very solid over the past 3 years, because low, solid expectations were the only kind that did not collapse. And this conversation was doing something to the architecture of what she had allowed herself to believe was possible. "It is not a simple matter," she said. "Even with the letter, even if your solicitor applies pressure, my uncle he is not a man who releases things easily." "No," the Duke agreed. "I don't imagine he is. It could take years, yes, and there is no guarantee of outcome. There rarely is." He paused. "But the letter exists, and I have it, and I know your name now." He said the last part with a particular plainness, as though he was making note of something that would turn out to be relevant. "Those things seem, at minimum, like a beginning." She stood up from her father's chair. She still had the letter in her hand. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had bought her house and found her father's words and had been sitting with them for 3 weeks, trying to decide what the right thing to do was. She was not certain she trusted him. She was not certain she trusted anyone anymore. Not fully, not in the way she had trusted people before she understood what they were capable of doing quietly and legally, and with a great deal of paperwork. But she thought she trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in 3 years. This was not a high bar, and she was aware of that, and she thought he was probably aware of it too. "I should go back," she said, "before I am missed." "Yes," he said. She moved toward the door, and then she stopped, because there was something else she needed to say, and she was not sure she would find the right moment for it later. "The roses on the east wall," she said. "They need cutting back before the frost. My father wrote about it. He said they become unmanageable if you leave them." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I have been meaning to see to it. I didn't know. I wasn't certain when the right time was. Now," she said, "before the end of October. That's when my father always did it." He nodded once. "I'll see that it's done." She opened the library door. The sounds of the dinner came back in full, voices and movement, and the ordinary noise of people who had no idea what had just occurred in this room, which was perhaps most things, Philippa thought. Most things happened in rooms where no one outside knew what had occurred. She stepped back into the hallway. She was still wearing gray. She still answered to the name Marsh. But the letter was in her hand, in her father's writing, and it said her name, and somewhere in that house a man was standing in a library thinking about roses and what the right thing to do was. It was not a victory. It was not an ending. It was the first morning in 3 years that felt, in some small and careful way, like a beginning. She walked back down the hall to where the guests were laughing, and she was not any of the things she had been this morning, not entirely, and the house around her was the same house it had always been. Her grandmother's roses waiting outside in the dark, her father's initials cut into the stone above the kitchen door, and none of that had changed. And perhaps, she thought, some things were more permanent than the paperwork that tried to erase them.